All right, A&P1 students, in this video we're going to continue talking about our skeletal system. So let me real quick jump to our objectives. And so in the last videos we talked about the different types of bone cells, and we also talked about bone formation and how it differs from bone resorption. So now we're going to kind of continue with the bone formation and talk a little bit more in detail about how that happens in the human body. So the first objectives that we need to cover, though, is we need to understand the scaffolding or the framework tissue that has to be present in order for bone to form. And so there's two types of tissue that we're going to talk about, hyaline cartilage and mesenchyme, that have to be present, and they will be, again, like kind of the scaffolding or the tissue that the bone can then form within. So we need to know a little bit more about these tissues. So first we'll talk about hyaline cartilage in a little bit more detail than we have before. So let me show you that. Go back to our picture. So if you remember, in the lab portion we had you identify hyaline cartilage underneath the microscope, in this case through a slide, a picture of the hyaline cartilage underneath the microscope. And we had this, these little areas. You can see the nuclei, those little dark purple. Those are the nuclei of the cells, and you can actually see the cells too, and with some of those. And then they have this like little area around them. And those cells, because we're looking at hyaline cartilage, which is a type of cartilage, we call those cells chondroblast and chondrocytes. So chondro is one of those prefixes that we had you learn that refers to cartilage. So that's why they will call these cells chondroblast or chondrocytes. And so what those cells are doing, they're producing this extracellular material. They call it like the cartilage matrix. That's what they're producing, and so you have a little bit of, you have collagen in there, you have some proteoglycans, and some ground substance, so it's producing this sort of matrix. So that is what hyaline cartilage looks like, and the cells that are associated with it, the chondroblast and the chondrocytes. And it's similar to those similar to the osteoblasts and osteocytes, where in this case, once this chondroblast produces all of this cartilage matrix around it, starts secreting all these molecules around it that form this matrix, then it gets trapped within that matrix, and then once it's trapped, then it is going to transform or differentiate into a chondrocyte. So the chondroblast one is the one that actually makes the cartilage, or this cartilage matrix, and then the chondrocyte is kind of trapped in that cartilage matrix, and it'll just maintain it at that point. So, okay, so let's go back to our textbook. And this is the information about the hyaline cartilage. So it's good to know what cells are associated with the hyaline cartilage. So they're the chondroblasts that will eventually become chondrocytes. And what they're producing is the cartilage matrix. And another thing that we want to be aware of, and again, remember I'm going to mention blood vessels and nerve tissue within most of our organs and our body systems. So for the cartilage, the mature cartilage, it does not have any blood vessels in it, and there are no nerves in it as well. So that's like the exact opposite of bone tissue, right? Because bone tissue has many blood vessels, and it has many nerves, like sensory nerves. But cartilage, mature cartilage, is the opposite. There's no blood vessels and there's no nerves in there. So it's going to still need, it's got cells in it, chondroblast, chondrocytes, still going to need oxygen and nutrients from the blood. So it gets it by diffusion of blood vessels that are adjacent to that cartilage, that hyaline cartilage. So that's how it gets it. But there's not actually any blood vessels or nerves, sensory nerves in cartilage. So, all right, and then we will revisit this quality of cartilage when we talk about articulations or joints, because that will play a big factor in healing. So, all right, so that is what you need to know about our hyaline cartilage. Just a little basic information, because again, this hyaline cartilage is going to serve as the scaffolding or framework for the formation of bone in humans. So we need to have a little background information about the hyaline cartilage. Okay, and we have two ways that we have two different processes that the various bones in our bodies will form. So the other way, the bone will form from a different tissue called the mesenchyme. So on our objectives here, we want to learn about mesenchyme. So mesenchyme, got it on here. I kind of went back to chapter 5, which is on the tissues, because that's where they talk about mesenchyme. And you don't have to know a whole lot of information about mesenchyme. Just want you to, when we talk about it as the scaffolding or kind of the beginning framework for bone formation, we just want you to know what we're talking about when we say mesenchyme. So the very first connective tissue in the embryo, so that's like right after we have the fertilization of the egg by the sperm, we have that embryo. It's one of the very first tissues that form is called mesenchyme. And then mesenchyme is one of those cells that eventually could change into like a muscle cell or a bone cell or something, another type of cell. But initially the cells start as mesenchymal cells, so we call it mesenchyme. So that's the type of tissue that will also, for certain bones, be the scaffolding and framework for bone formation. So we need to be familiar with those two connective tissues. All right, so I'm going to head back to our objectives. And so now that we have a little bit of background information on our hyaline cartilage and mesenchyme, we'll talk about this first type of bone formation. And it's called intramembranous ossification. So now what we're talking about in these objectives here, we're talking about the very first time that bone is formed. So we're talking about bones forming when the human is still in the uterus. So we're still a embryo and fetus. So that's what we're talking about. So they use this term called ossification. So it's kind of like the term that means the very first bone formation. So this is kind of describing how certain bones in our skeletal system form initially. And then we'll talk about other bones in our skeletal system may form by this other type of ossification called endochondral ossification. So, but for the rest of this video, we're going to focus on this type of ossification or formation of bone in the fetus, and it's called intramembranous ossification. Okay, so let's move back to our textbook. Okay, so ossification is the term. There's two types that we mentioned, intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. So ossification, again, is that first formation of bone or connective tissue that happens when begins when we're an embryo, and then bone will continue to form after we're born, but it starts in the embryo, so we talk about that process. Okay. So when we're talking about intramembranous ossification, one big thing to know is that the kind of the framework or scaffolding for this type of bone formation is the mesenchymal tissue or mesenchyme that we mentioned before. So the mesenchyme is the tissue that is in place for a few of our bones, which we'll talk about in the next paragraph. So, so our bones will start to form and have that particular shape, but initially they're all made up of this mesenchyme, which is a very early embryonic connective tissue. So the bones that you will see this type of bone formation development happen in would be like the flat bones of the cranium. So frontal bone would be an example, parietal bone, temporal bone. Not all, but some of the facial bones are also ones that will form by this type of ossification. And then the central part of the clavicle or our collarbone will also. So not a lot of bones, and they're mainly the ones that are in our head, and then of course the clavicle's part of our upper limb. But the rest of them are more in the head, and it's not every one of them. So when we're developing our skeletal system, forming it when we're an embryo / fetus, our frontal bone will form, and our parietal bones and our temporal bones, and they'll be the shape that they're supposed to be, but they'll just be made up of this mesenchyme, so they won't actually be bone tissue, so they don't have the qualities to actually be bone tissue. So over time, what happens is the mesenchyme tissue gets replaced by bone tissue, and so there are a few steps in that whole process, and they have a picture showing the steps, and then they also break it down here as well. So I generally just look at the picture to go over these steps. So they're looking at the frontal bone here, showing this process of bone being formed within the embryo or fetus. So again, this is these little cells that you see here, and this tissue around them, that's kind of this pinkish tissue, that is all the mesenchymal or mesenchyme. That's the tissue that the bone was originally, or that was the tissue there before the bone formed. So what will happen is those mesenchymal cells will differentiate. So that means they'll kind of transform into an osteoblast. And what happens is you'll have more than one of those mesenchymal cells differentiate into an osteoblast. And what they will do is they'll form this little area. They'll kind of clump all together and form this little area that they call an ossification center. And so remember, we know what the osteoblasts do. They're going to produce the osteoid. So a lot of collagen, some proteoglycans are in there. So they're going to produce that, so you can see that kind of osteoid around there. So that's the kind of the beginning part of bone formation there. So this picture shows that we got the osteoid. So the next thing that will happen is the calcium, the phosphate, the minerals from our blood will come in, and remember that it'll deposit or cause calcification of that osteoid. And so these little osteoblasts eventually, when they lay down all that osteoid and it gets all calcified, then they're kind of trapped in there, so they become the osteocytes. But you still have these osteoblasts out here, and the osteoblasts continue to lay down more osteoid, minerals come in and calcify it, and you get more bone. And then it just pretty much from this one ossification center just kind of spreads, the bone kind of spreads out, and you're basically just replacing the mesenchymal tissue, the mesenchyme, with this bone tissue. So this is showing where we have a bunch more of our bone tissue. In this case, it's should make you think of spongy bone, because we got a lot of spaces in there, so it's forming this spongy bone. Continues to form spongy bone, keeps moving out, and again, eventually we'll get this compact bone as well on the side. So this is a flat bone, so we'll have like the spongy bone in the center, and then compact bone on either side. It's kind of like a spongy bone sandwich there.